I'm being so serious when I say this. Someone needs to plant the idea in Trump's mind that if the government is bailing out farms again to the tune of billions of dollars again, then the government needs to be taking an ownership stake in the farms. And believe it or not, small, salt-of-the-earth farmers should be on board with this plan. But nationalizing the farms, it's not without precedent. Firstly, you'll remember a couple of months ago when Trump, on behalf of the government, took a 10% ownership stake in Intel stock. Not because Intel needed a bailout per se, but he was using grants that had already been granted to or promised to Intel, and instead using them to purchase the stock on behalf of the government. But also, and probably in a better example of this sort of thing was done in response to the financial crisis. TARP, or the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which is now mostly just known as the infamous bank bailout, wasn't actually just the government or the taxpayers giving financial institutions and these banks a whole bunch of money. It was actually us buying a bunch of their stocks and later selling them, ideally for a profit. Now, obviously, there were issues with TARP. It's not the infamous bank bailout for no reason, but mainly those issues can be summed up as the people who should have gone to prison didn't, and the regulations that should have been put in place to prevent that from happening again weren't. But the mechanism by which we, the taxpayers, bailed out a bunch of companies by nationalizing an ownership stake in them, thus ensuring that the system didn't collapse even further, that part worked, as did the part where we sold those shares down the line. AIG, for example, which technically wasn't under TARP itself, but is the perfect example of this working phenomenally. We purchased a controlling ownership stake of AIG for $183 or so billion, and then when we sold it, we netted $22.3 billion or something like that. And obviously not every single acquisition and sale is going to net the government profit, which some people think is just fundamentally wrong. Also, while TARP didn't technically do this, we could theoretically set up requirements for who could buy back that stake and how. But the idea would be that if you're too big to fail, then maybe you're too big to remain privatized, at least for now. But this is where the small farmers come in and why they should support this idea. By far, the biggest defense I've seen to this farmer bailout, again, which I remind you they need not because they grow food for Americans, but because they grow animal feed for a country that no longer wants it. And by the way, is unlikely to want it again in the coming years. These are crops that are growing a supply for what is no longer going to be a demand. Free market, who? But the biggest defense is that these bailouts aren't going to the small, salt-of-the-earth American farmer. No, these bailouts are largely going to big corporate farms. There's a minimum of like 6,000 acres or so, whatever. And if in fact that's true, that only makes my proposal even better. If these big corporate farms made a bet on growing a commodity that is not actually in demand, if these big corporate farms that have largely eaten up the small farmers made a bet on growing a commodity that is no longer in demand, all because they knew that worst case scenario, that there is little to no risk in farming only because the government will always make up for the shortfalls, then I think that a government bailout should come with a government ownership stake. Too big to fail, too big to be privatized. Not only could this result in the government or us not doing things like, starting trade wars that would make our very own assets worthless, it could also mean that these farms that are too big to fail weren't allowed to take as many risks. But also, and most importantly, when it finally came time for us to sell off this ownership stake again, we could ensure that it was actually going back into the hands of small farmers. Or it could even be put into something like a community land trust. You know? Something that would actually benefit and belong to the farming communities that we keep pretending we're trying so hard to protect. But what do I know? I actually care about the country as a whole, not just a selfish few. All I'm saying is if we're giving them a bunch of our money anyway, we might as well get something in exchange. So who's going to plant that seed in Trump's brain and make him think it was his idea? All jokes aside, I genuinely think we could get him to do it. So if you're on his app, you know what to do.